This is a Film Stories original podcast.
We made this.
Welcome back, everybody, to the X-Cast, as ever, but truth is in here. I'm your host today, Carl Sweeney, and thank you very much for joining me for this episode, which is a deep dive into Season 6. So obviously we're coming towards the close of the season with the main episodes, and I thought now would be an appropriate time to speak to Chris Knowles about what was really going on with the X-Files at this point in its history. Hey, Chris.
Hey. Hello, X-Cast family.
Yeah.
Hello, how's everybody doing? Everybody doing out there in cyberspace?
I think we're all doing okay, except I feel like there are some things we should know about Season 6 that we maybe don't. So I think that's kind of what we're here to clear up today. Yeah, so what we're going to do a bit of a deep dive. We'll start with kind of an overview of the season, and I think we'll zoom in on some of the stuff going on with episodes like Field Trip and Biogenesis as we go on. Okay, let's start with a broad overview then. The big news, I think, with coming into Season 6 is the move to Los Angeles, which obviously affected how the series looked, but I suppose also how it was made in other ways too, which a viewer might not necessarily consider. Things like how they got around from place to place and how much money they could spend on certain things. How well do you think the series made that adjustment? Because it's obviously a big thing that affects what we see on screen. How do you feel about it?
I think it made the adjustment really well, but I think it was extremely difficult because you basically had this really great crew, well, cast too, right? But you had this great crew up in Vancouver who were really hardworking, and you just had these just phenomenal people who could just pull rabbit out of hat after rabbit out of a hat. You know, somebody like Graham Murray, who could just do things practically overnight that people on movies couldn't do in a month. So that really hurt. Chris Carter's never been shy about talking about how he moved to Los Angeles under duress.
Yeah.
It was not his decision. He was not happy about it. He was not happy about leaving the people that he said had become his family up there. So it was very difficult. And, you know, you talked about the traffic and getting around. I mean, anybody who's been to Los Angeles, you're going to know. It's so funny because I was in Los Angeles couple summers ago, and the guy we were coming up from Orange County, and the guy who was driving the car said, you know, just watch, once we cross the Los Angeles River, you know, the traffic just magically appears out of nowhere. And it does. It was freaky. And it just Los Angeles is very poorly planned. It's much too dense, you know, at least in the center of it. And it's very expensive to get around. The unions are very powerful. You know, for instance, like the carpenters union and the truckers union, they're very powerful, or they were very powerful at that point in time. They're probably a lot less so now because much less production is being done in Los Angeles. But it was very hard. It was very hard for them. You didn't have that kind of, you know, where you could go 20 minutes out of downtown Vancouver and be in like a snowy mountain, or you could be in the forest, or you could be, you know, all in the farmland. You had this much more condensed metropolitan area in Vancouver that it was just much easier to do location scouting and stuff. So it got a lot. The figure I had heard from someone inside the show is that it cost 3 times as much to produce an episode in Los Angeles than it did in Vancouver, which is just, you know, it's almost inconceivable because I think, you know, I don't have the exact figures in my head right now, but I know that each episode was costing at least $2 or $3 million in Vancouver.
So given all of that, I'm just looking down the list of episodes here. Of course, the season starts off with the beginning, following up on the movie, and then Drive, Triangle. But given that they've had this big shift, do you think they had any other option really other than to really acknowledge the fact this is a new series? You know, we start with the baking hot Sunday in the beginning. Mulder's driving out on the open road in Drive, and there are other episodes as the season goes on, which you never would have seen in Vancouver. But given that when they get to season 8, they are able to approximate that Vancouver atmosphere fairly well. But do you think that would just not have been possible immediately in season 6?
Well, Rob Bowman had said that he basically had the assignment of readjusting the look for the new show, which basically what it was.
Yeah.
And you like everyone has said, you didn't have that great atmosphere. And it isn't just like the overcast and the drizzle and so on. The lighting up in Vancouver is very strange because it's very far north,
Mm-hmm.
and like probably similar to where you are, right?
Frozen
You're in Yorkshire.
I'm actually in the middle of England, but I've been up. I used to live up north, Lancashire. Yeah.
Okay, so like just picture like somewhere in the Scottish Highlands, I guess would probably be the equivalent. The lighting is just very almost surreal. So it wasn't just the atmosphere and the people. I mean, they lost a lot, and people who have worked, particularly people in the executive level like Chris Carter, really talked about how much more difficult it became to create that kind of atmosphere of creeping dread that they were able to conjure so well in Vancouver. I mean, Los Angeles has its own reasons for creeping dread, but maybe in the 1990s less so. And they were sort of going out to a lot of these areas where like these neighborhoods just looked like any suburban neighborhood in the United States. I mean, they could do that fairly well, even though I had mentioned when they did NME, and it's supposed to be, I guess, in Pennsylvania or something. And it's just like, yeah. There aren't a lot of palm trees and cactuses in Pennsylvania. It was difficult. And I think the other thing too, so one of the things you have to really put in context is that the culture had changed so much. 1993 and 1995, are only 5 years apart, but they might as well just been in different centuries. It was, the mood was much different. The culture was much different. Just the economy was much different, which I think had a lot to do with it. It was harder to sort of sell that kind of paranoia and creeping dread in 1998. It might have been easier in 2000, certainly 2000. Well, actually, maybe not in 2001, but, later on in the series, like they were able to adjust and hold on to the audience. But the mood of the country in 1998 was just much different. It was boom time, and I think that's why they sort of front loaded a lot of this comedy stuff in the first half of the season. I was one of those fans who was just like, what the hell am I watching here? Ed Asner and Lily Tomlin. What is this? The Carol Burnett show or something? What is it? 1974 all of a sudden. So I did not take that adjustment well. And even when they started to do the more serious stories, I think there were a lot of limitations that, a story like SR 819, which is, very much a back to basics, old school, like season 3 X-Files story. It has a different look. It has a different feel. It's not quite the same. And I think that had a lot of effect on the diminishment of the ratings throughout the season. But another thing that I think also hurt is that, don't forget, this is the year that The Sopranos premiered on HBO and took a lot of the X-Files audience away, and then also Alias on ABC. So there was a lot more competition during that time slot than there had been before.
And the X-Files had been everywhere, hadn't it, in the years preceding this, or at least a couple of years preceding this, magazine covers and...
Well, especially after, during season 5, it was just super saturated, And the movie, I think, didn't do as well as I think a lot of people had hoped. I think there are a lot of reasons for that. One of which is, Bob Goodwin said that, it's just a really bad idea to try to launch a movie while you're still running a series, because people, if they have the choice of seeing one show or other, they're going to be like, well, I can watch X-Files on Sunday night. I don't have to $30 or something to go see this now. So I think that has a lot to do with it. But I think just the luster had started to wear off. And, like I said, the ratings really started to fall. I mean, they lost over the course of this season. They opened up with 20 million viewers, which is just absolutely unimaginable today, right?
Yeah.
And then ended the series with almost 16. And I think that was basically, in aggregate, that would probably be the overall average, somewhere in the 16 to 17 million range, which is certainly a hit, but just not that, all powerful.
White hot.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think Darren had said to me, I think after Two Fathers, I don't think the original series hit those kind of highs in terms of the ratings again. It kind of gradually tailed off after that. I just want to get some quick thoughts from you on maybe some particular episodes and things. So how do you feel the beginning fares coming off the film? Because obviously Chris Carter, he had to do the end, to set up a film he'd already written. And then the beginning has to lead out of a film that he's not sure if all of the television audience has seen. Do you feel like things like The Syndicate by this point are getting a bit tired and kind of we've seen it all before? How do you feel about about the beginning in general?
Well, what they had to do is that they had to somehow tie in the story that they had with the end with Fight the Future. And those are two basically entirely different stories that were written and filmed at two different times. One was filmed in April of 1998 and the other one was filmed like June, July of 97. So that's a huge stretch there. I really disliked the beginning for a long time. And I think it had less to do with the story itself and more to do with just the fact that, oh, okay, we're in LA now. And we've got these really terrible supporting actors doing really bad line readings. And, when Chris Carter mythology is going to challenge any actor to deliver naturally. But, when that guy's like, there's a rattle trap account and just like, oh, come on, it's just, it just didn't work. And the actors too, just, those LA actors where they all want to be stars. They don't want to just be like,
that's a good point.
Number 6, So I think that the downgrade in quality in the acting was something that I noticed right away. And I think that that's something that the show never really recovered from. And it's just that Vancouver actors are trained in that old school British style where it's like, this isn't about you. This is about the story.
The repertory.
You serve the story. The story does not serve you. And I just think that is, certainly in 1998 Hollywood, that was just out of the question. Everybody was the next John Travolta. They just needed to convince the casting.
The right person. Yeah. Okay, so what about Drive? It seems to me like Vince Gilligan's got a great knack for seeing the possibilities that are offered to him. So here he really makes advantage of the new setting, I think. When we get to season 8 and Roadrunners, he really knows how to tell a good story with those characters there. So like Drive, I think, is an early season example of what this series could do in this new setting. A very good example of it.
Well, it's a great episode, great direction, and really does, like you said, make great use of that hot, sunny desert setting that I don't think the beginning did quite as well with. It's interesting because, everybody obviously knows this is Speed, right? So
yes.
I was looking at an article. I just ordered a bunch of old X-Files magazines, and it was sort of like this article on like all the episodes and the movies that they sort of lifted ideas from. So it would be like Ice, obviously lifting from The Thing, and something that I hadn't considered before was Tithanus lifts from The Eyes of Laura Mars. But they listed like a bunch of episodes, like a bunch of Vince Gilligan episodes, and like Groundhog Day. Pusher comes straight out of Firestarter. Up and down the line, and I was just kind of laughing about it because it's just like, Vince is so great and he's such a great writer, but I don't know if he's like the most original concept guy there is out there. Yeah. But this is a great episode, great performance, and of course, the magic that was kindled here was later flowered in the form of Breaking Bad. So I think that there's a nice bit of foreshadowing there.
Yeah, obviously Bryan Cranston and just a sense of kinetic energy to it, which Breaking Bad kind of accelerates as it goes along and all of that. Now, Triangle, and then slightly later, How to Ghost Stole Christmas. I always feel like I don't like these weird Chris Carter directorial assignments like I should. Yeah, because a lot of people they love Triangle, they love How to Go Stole Christmas, Postmodern Prometheus. Perhaps fewer people like Improbable. Actually, is the one I like the most out of that quartet.
Oh, I love Improbable. Yeah,
Triangle has never dazzled me like it dazzles other people. Is it just a gimmick they're in search of a story? You know, how do you feel about Triangle? What do you think?
Well, I'm a bit hobbled when I watch Triangle because I know the story that he lifted the premise from. It was an old Shadow comic from, I think, 1973 or 1974. But it's the same exact story, you know, like this scientist is being taken over on this cruise ship, and then the cruise ship is, you know, keel hauled and hijacked by Nazis and so on. And so, I mean, it is just pretty much the same exact story.
But hang on, this is Chris Carter, who doesn't read comics, yeah?
This is the Chris Carter who doesn't read comics. This is the one comic he read, you know, this obscure, you know, Shadow comic. Of course, that could be entirely coincidental. I tend to doubt it. But, you know, whoever, whatever, you know, you take it as it comes. But, yeah, I think it's a phenomenal achievement and something that I don't think had ever been done on television and hasn't probably been done since. And I love the banter with Scully and all those scenes.
The FBI stuff's good.
See, but this to me is like, this is not really happening. This is like Mulder needs, you know, he needs a fresh brain rinse. So they needed some sort of pretext to get the army base so he can get some fresh injections. So, I mean, that's just me, but you know, we can get into that later.
Yeah.
I understand Chris Carter, you know, I think he's someone who's like, he's very restless. He's like a very restless mind. And he's always like, you know, he's the kind of person who's always looking for a new challenge just to, you know, keep him engaged, you know? And I think that's one of the problems with some of the mid-period and latter period mythology is that I just don't think he was engaged. He was focused on other things. And he just wasn't feeling it, you know? I think he was feeling it more, some, you know, the work in this season and in season 7 and certainly season 8, I think was the most engaged he had been since season 3. But I just think, you know, he's the kind of person, you know, it's like he needs that adrenaline rush of like a new challenge, you know, an impossible feat. That fired the show in ways that people don't appreciate to this day. And people just don't understand, like, that you had this guy at the top who just always needed to be pushing at the envelope, you know, who always needed to be like finding new challenges just to keep himself engaged, you know, just to keep his interest up. And that was part of what made the series so great. And I think it's something that, you know, most fans and critics just have no concept of.
Yeah, it's one of those things. I do like Triangle. I don't love it in the way many people do.
No, I agree, but I hate How the Ghost Stole Christmas. I hate that episode so much. So you know.
Well, I like the first 10 minutes or so until the ghosts show up. Basically, I feel like you could have a decent little haunted house tale. What is it you hate about it? Is the cast members, the guest cast?
I think the casting kills it. I think you could have gotten away with that same script if you didn't have these like unbelievably hammy, overexposed actors doing the line readings. You know, I mean, at this point in time, Ed Asner was just playing Ed Asner. I mean, Ed Asner had been playing Ed Asner since the Mary Tyler Moore Show, but, you know, especially here, you know, he's just playing himself, and it's just like, he's like, oh, just let's get this over with. You know? And Lily Tomlin is just, you know, she was probably very funny in the 60s, but by 1998, the comedy gods had long since stopped smiling on Lily Tomlin. So it's the kind of thing where maybe if they cast those roles differently, it would have been better. You know, and by the same token, it's like, I really like Improbable. And one of the things that sells that episode so well is Burt Reynolds.
Yeah.
You know, because he's obviously playing Burt, but he's playing Burt like, you know, Burt's been a little humbled. You know, Burt realizes he's no longer the sole focus of Hollywood's attention. So he's going to give you that great Burt Reynolds energy, but he's not going to do so in a way that takes you out of the story. Yeah. So I think that was like kind of the best of both worlds. I'm just trying to figure out Was Boogie Nights before?
Yeah, a couple of years before. I was just thinking that because he actually didn't like Boogie Nights apparently, but I think he was off on the way. Burt Reynolds apparently didn't have a good time on that film.
Oh, but he's so great in it.
He's excellent. Yeah, really good.
I think that's one of his best performances ever. That was just a great movie, and he was just phenomenal in it. Sometimes when you don't enjoy it, that means you're just really working hard to sell the character, and I think that's what.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess stuff like Triangle is kind of bracketed under the X-Files light umbrella that we've talked a lot about during season 6 on the X-Cast.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say the core episodes that make up that category would be, Dreamland, Dreamland 2, and then The Rain King slightly later.
Oh, and The Rain King, which I cannot begin to describe how much I loathe that episode.
How much do you think this is just a lot to do with sequencing as well? Because it's a real run, isn't it? It's Triangle, then the Dreamlands, then How to Ghost Stole Christmas. Terms of Endearment is kind of the outlier in that group.
But it's still of that piece. I think it's still of that piece. I mean, I think Terms of Endearment is great. I really love Terms of Endearment. Would it be as great without Bruce Campbell? Maybe, maybe not. I mean, he really sells that character. Again, it's like the Burt Reynolds thing and Improbable. Bruce Campbell really sells that character in a way that I don't think a lot of other actors could. But it is of the piece. It's like Triangle, Dreamland, Dreamland 2, How the Ghost, blah, 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 blah. Terms of Endearment, The Rain King. It's just like, I am just so over this run of not funny comedies.
Do you feel there's a missed opportunity with the fact that, because Terms of Endearment has the Spender cameo, but it's always seemed potentially interesting to me that you have Spender and Fowley down there. And, what exactly does it look like if they have to go out on a case, I don't know. Do you feel like maybe we should have seen a little bit more of them at least? I
think we should have seen a lot of them, a lot more of them. I would have liked them to have been in, every episode, or at least every other episode, just a lot more episodes than there were. One of the problems, one of the things that I would fault X-Files production staff for is that they just were a little too sensitive about what a vocal minority of the fan base was saying. So people on the boards and on Usenet really hated Spender and especially Mimi Rogers, especially Fowley.
Yeah.
So I think they really pulled back on those characters because they just got a little gun shy about alienating this very, very small but very, very vocal minority on the internet. I don't think they really understood at that point. Just these people were not representative of the large audience. This was a small core, self-selecting core of fans that had very particular views that were not expressed in the fandom outside. So I just think that Chris Owens, who's great, and maybe they could have done a lot more to make his character a little more sympathetic, I guess, maybe. But I think they just got a little nervous again about fan reaction. And I think that was a big mistake. And I think that maybe killing off his character in One Son, well, not killing him off. I think that was a bit of a mistake too. He had been signed for, I think he'd been signed for 11 or 12 episodes that he was supposed to appear in, and he appeared in a lot less than that. I mean, he appeared in Beginning, Triangle, Terms of Endearment, Two Fathers and One Son. He moved from Toronto to LA just to do this role. Yeah, I'm not a real big fan of how he was treated, particularly since he's such a good actor and could play a lot more than just this wet blanket that he was written as.
So the season, I guess we get a run of episodes, SR819, Tivernus, Two Fathers and One Son, which is a bit of a shift again, back to more serious stuff. I think of that group, I think Tivernus in particular is the standout. That's a fantastic episode, I think.
Oh, it's phenomenal. And the only way it could have been better is that if they shot it in the 5th season instead of the 6th season. I think that would have been a great 5th season. But maybe they thought it was a little too similar to Mind's Eye, I guess. A little bit similar kind of thing. But it's interesting because it's Vince Gilligan and the photography again, because he did the whole Ted Serios thing in season 4
on Rue.
With Rue. So I think it's interesting that he went back to that well. But again, this is also the Eyes of Laura Mars thing, though. Certainly, Jeffrey Lee Lewis is no Faye Dunaway circa 1977.
Yeah. Very different. So we see a bit of Kirsch in Tivernus. What do you think about what happened with him? Because through the early episodes, they seem quite minded to include him wherever they can. It seems like it's possibly building to something that never really comes in season 6, does it? Because he's very peripheral in that Two Fathers, One Son two-parter.
Well, again, I wonder if this is overreacting to fan opinion. I thought Kirsch was great. The show really needed Kirsch because Skinner was just getting a little too cuddly. I think it was detracting from the drama because Skinner's so clearly on their side and he's always going to go to bat for them and so on and so forth. Without that antagonism, I think it starts to lose believability. So the thing that's so great about Kirsch, and Kirsch I think is phenomenal in Triangle. I just think that's a great performance, and he got great lines to read too. So I think that helped. And I love him in what do you call it? Tithonus? I thought it was Tithonus. Whatever. It doesn't matter.
I've never heard it. I've only read it, so you could be right.
Yeah, I believe it's Tithonus, but whatever. It doesn't matter.
Okay.
I love his performance in that too. I love when he goes, "Mulder's a lost cause." I'm betting you're not. That was a great line, and just his carriage. It was just so believable. And again, I think it brought a little bit back of that antagonism between Mulder and Scully and the FBI brass that the show really needed and I think missed.
Now, Two Fathers, One Son, so of course an attempt to sort of turn the page on the mythology. To an extent, I mean, the Syndicate gets incinerated, but the Smoky Man survives, Fowley survives, Krychek's still around. Spender is down, but as it turns out in season 9, not actually out.
All the people that they had to pay to fly down from Vancouver are out, basically. Well, I know, of course, William Davis and Nick Lee were still in Vancouver. No, I agree with you. I think the Syndicate, I was tired of the Syndicate in season 3. Halfway through season 3, I'm just like, really? Do we have to still go through this? And I really, really strongly disliked the Syndicate in the first half of the myth arc of season 4, particularly and Termer. It was deadly. It was like I was reading a John le Carre novel or something. It just really wooden and flat. I did not miss them. I was glad to see them go. I just thought they outlived their usefulness a long time before. And like I've said before, and I probably said it to you, it's a lot more effective when we don't know who these people are that are pulling the strings, when we don't see them lurking in the shadows. It's just a lot more effective when we're afraid because we're wondering, what the hell are we up against? Who are these people? When you put a face on it, it's just going to lessen the fright factor,
But also the fact when they put names to everything that's been going on. So like the Smoky Man gets the long speech, doesn't he, to Mulder in One Son. The alien fetus gave us the alien genome, which gave us the alien human hybrid, all that stuff.
I like that speech, though. I really do like that.
I think he delivers it very well, but it's a very tough ask for an actor, isn't it?
Well, see, what it was is that there was a lot of pressure on 1013 to just sort of explain everything. Particularly Chris and Frank were saying to them, listen, you don't want to do that. You want to just keep this open because if you explain everything, you take away the mystery. You want to just keep this mystery going and just keep adding questions because you need people to constantly be wondering and, gathering around the water cooler the next morning and arguing about what they thought was really going on and so on and so forth. I think that I didn't mind the Syndicate getting written out because, like I said, they just became very tiresome and ponderous. But I think what they should have communicated better, and maybe this is the problem of like the Fox PR department, is that everybody just assumed that the alien colonization storyline was finished. Like the mythology was finished. And I would see this all the time online, like, all these fans complaining, what they called Chris Carter syndrome, where you just pick up a story that you told everybody was over, and I didn't necessarily think like the aliens story was going to be over after that, because they'd established throughout the series that the syndicate were just players in it, and all of a sudden we had this battle between the colonists and the faceless aliens. I mean, they sort of dropped that pretty quickly, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
but I got to tell you something though. I think a lot of the decisions that were made, particularly this decision, I've wondered for a long time, like what fired this decision to do this two-parter. And I think it was twofold. I think there were two influences on this story. First of all was the cost. It was just getting much too expensive to do those kind of stories that they were doing, with like basically feature film production values. You can do that in Vancouver, but you can't do that in Los Angeles, particularly Los Angeles in 1998, when the real estate market was just totally overheated, and big, the .com boom. I mean, everything had just gotten really expensive, and I just think it just became very difficult to do, not only because of the cost, but like we talked about before, like getting around, like going to all these different locations, taking all these, like they would take, I don't know, like 15, 20 giant tractor trailers, or lorries as you call them over there for some reason, on these shoots. It was like this huge logistical nightmare. So I think that did have a lot to do with it. The other thing too is that I just think they wanted to just cut away some of that excess accumulation, and maybe get a fresh start, which we can talk about with biogenesis, and we can maybe touch upon why I don't think the biogenesis storyline was necessarily carried out. But again, like I just think it just became too difficult to pull this stuff off. And the other factor I think that is really important as well is what we touched on before, is that, like UFO fever had kind of peaked. You had a lot of like Men in Black and Independence Day, and we're just getting a little UFO'd out. I think, people were just sort of tired of like the whole alien invasion storylines, and, they just needed to do something different. I think they did, a very good job in conceiving something different, but for a number of different reasons, they didn't pursue that.
Okay, so then season 6 kind of shifts gears again after One Sun, because we have Aguamala, Monday, Arcadia, and Alpha. So I suppose of those episodes, it's not until Alpha that you get a traditional episode, isn't it? They get a case, they go and investigate it, and so on. Because Aguamala, Arthur Dales calls them in. Monday is this weird time loop thing, and Arcadia is another sort of sitcom-y premise, isn't it? So what do you think? I think Monday's a great episode. I think Arcadia is a lot of fun. Aguamala I don't like, and Alpha I think is very flat. What do you think?
Well, I think it kind of showed that doing traditional case X-Files had just worn out its welcome, I think, by this point. It's very hard when you do these big apocalyptic life or death, the whole world's fate is at risk here with 2001 Sun, and then go to like, goofing around with some sort of like goofy apartment, like that. Aguamala is just a terrible episode.
It's very shrill, isn't it? It's very loud, and
it's just, I don't know. But the thing you got to really understand is that this is really these people working on the show are working round the clock sometimes.
Yeah.
All week, maybe they have like Sunday off, but this is hard work.
Yeah.
And when you do like something Two Fathers, One Son, which is just a huge logistical production, you get tired. You know what I mean? It's not easy work. It's very, very hard work. And I just think that we watching as fans are like, oh, well, they made this episode bad because they don't like me personally. They read what I wrote on like, the old X-Files board. What was that like on Prodigy? I don't even remember what it was on. But it's like, this is like a personal assault on me. And it's just like, no, it isn't. It's just, it's a very hard job. And I think that there were so many challenges this season, the move, the change in the political climate, the sort of the death of the third or fourth wave of ufology. There were just so many headwinds that they were racing against. I mean, I think they did the best job they could. Monday is phenomenal episode.
Really good.
I
Really
love
good.
Arcadia. Alpha is pretty terrible. Maybe like would have been a good it has like a real season two vibe to you, doesn't it? Like, doesn't it feel like something from season 2? Like,
yeah, or Shapes even earlier, that kind of story, but without the sort of atmosphere and all that. Yeah.
For some reason, it reminds me a lot of Fearful Symmetry, and I'm not exactly sure. But it's funny because I know I know the guy who Andrew Robinson is playing, and he is actually that much of a dick. So
really?
I sort of get a kick out of it, for personal reasons, because it's like, oh yeah, they really nailed that character. So.
Okay, so then we get another run of episodes. I think Trevor is quite an underrated episode.
Yeah,
I think it's a very solid X-File, actually. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Is it just because it sits uneasily in a season full of weird, kind of off-format episodes that maybe people can't sort of see it for what it is, perhaps? It just kind of gets lost in the shuffle. I don't know.
I just think there are a lot of, like, similarities to Squeeze and Toombs in that episode. And there's also... maybe a lot of listeners won't be aware of this, but the basic storyline is taken from a Millennium episode from the first season, an episode called The Wild and the Innocent. Yeah, I mean, I like Trevor a lot. I think the direction is absolutely stunning. I mean, it is really film quality direction and cinematography. But it also, I got to tell you something. It reminds me so much of like these movies that you would go see in the 70s. Even like if you took away sort of the supernatural aspect of it, and, like it's a movie that like, Burt Reynolds or Jerry Reed or somebody would be in, just like these movies about the South and like rednecks on the rampage and stuff. I mean, it really has that vibe. So I really appreciate it for that. I mean, I could tell that, whoever was working on that episode really was processing, like a movie like Thunderbolt and Lightfoot or something.
Okay, so Milagro, I think, is one of the more multifaceted episodes, perhaps.
You could call it that.
What do you think is going on there? Because it, in some ways, quite an insular episode, kind of could come across as navel-gazing or what, but it's actually very strange and intriguing to me.
Played upon the dampened string of her instrument.
Yeah, but isn't that deliberately overwrought? And I suppose that's the debate,
Yeah. I find it especially interesting considering that it was, it was Frank's script and Chris kind of came in and elbowed him out of the way and wrote the final draft. So yeah, that's something that, isn't it very interesting? Very interesting indeed.
The next episode is The Unnatural. So David Duchovny behind the camera. I seem to remember you don't like this episode.
No, that's not true. That is not true. I hate this episode.
Okay.
with a singular passion, I hate this episode. I think this episode is a train wreck. The only thing I really like about this episode is the end when they're
the baseball.
Yeah, they're at the batting machine. That's a great scene. Wonderful scene. But the rest of it, I just it's just very condescending and patronizing. It's like this Hallmark greeting card or Thomas Kincaid painting take on race relations in 1940s. You know what I mean? It just comes across as really patronizing and condescending. I don't like that kind of, I don't even know how to put it. I just find it to be very mawkish. And I just don't think it serves the story well. I mean, I understand that he wanted to make a comedy episode and he wanted to have it be sort of like this Fantasia. But I just think that the way he handled it, it just came across as being a little bit tone deaf.
Do you think it would have been a bit less mawkish, perhaps, if because he had to bring in Emma McWalsh, didn't he, to play Arthur Dale's brother, which is kind of a sad story, isn't it? Because I think that Darren McGavin had been on set before falling ill, hadn't he? Something like that.
Yeah, well, they actually shot some footage with him.
Yeah,
and he did fall ill. I think that just when they recast, they should have said, I'm Arthur Dale's brother, but I'm not named Arthur Dale's. I mean, that's just like pushing the joke a little too far. You know what I mean? there's just all these kind of missteps that I just think they fail the story. But like I said, it's just like this whole soft focus, sunlit, Thomas Kincaid Hallmark card version of like a pretty serious issue in American history. I mean, race relations in like the South and Southwest in 1947. I just don't think it's something that you can be whimsical about.
Three of a Kind, The Lone Gunmen, their second featured outing really after Unusual Suspects the year before. This one is closer in tone, isn't it, to what their spin-off would become? A bit less serious. The rough edges are even more sanded down.
I really like this. I do like this episode, but it's just basically Unusual Suspects and goes to Vegas, right? I mean, it's the same storyline, but it's just set in Vegas.
Do you think they're already thinking at this point about spin-off and can these guys handle their own show? Yeah.
Well, they'd been talking about spin-off at least as early as the fourth season, maybe even earlier. So I'm not exactly sure what the impetus behind this particular episode is this like an in-series pilot, Yeah. I'm not exactly sure if that's what it was, but they had been discussing doing The Lone Gunmen pretty early on. And actually, one thing that Frank had said, he said, when they did The Lone Gunmen, it was just too late in the series run. Like the time had kind of passed for it.
So then we get to Field Trip and Biogenesis.
Yes, the main event.
The main event, yeah. So an episode like Field Trip, I think is very interesting in terms of, you've talked in the past about point of view storytelling. And I think any X-Files fan will see the importance to that, of point of view storytelling to an episode like, let's say, Bad Blood or Field Trip here. But you think it's more fundamental than that, don't you? You think point of view is very integral to the series kind of all the time, basically. Is that what you think? Or most of the time?
I know for a fact that, stories, writers' rooms, people in the writers' room spent a lot of time talking about POV. And they even did so on Millennium. Like talking about who is telling the story and how does that affect the storytelling? How does that affect the paranormal aspects of this, so on and so forth? How do we frame all this? Was a preoccupation for the writers of the show. I think that's something that is undervalued. And I think maybe they sometimes got a little too clever for their own good with that, right?
Like when?
Well, I don't know, maybe Babylon.
The classic example.
Yeah, I think that is a classic example. So it's not always like that whole Rashomon thing where you've got Bad Blood, right?
Yeah.
But I think that there was a lot of discussion with every episode because Chris Carter had like a number of things that he wanted every episode to sort of portray, right? Like he always said there always had to be a big boo, like you had to have a big, not necessarily a big scare, but you just had to have something happen that would just grab people's attention in every act, right? And like the whole thing, like it's only as scary as it's real. Everything has to be rendered in as realistic a way as they can possibly make it. And then, of course, the point of view storytelling. So all that plays in to how those stories were written. And I think that each one of those writers would, had they never worked for Chris Carter, would have written much different stories than they would later write. You know what I'm saying? I think that, again, like Chris Carter's true genius is as an executive producer, right? Somebody who would like come in and say, okay, these are the kind of stories I want to do. These are the kind of ideas that I want to put across in the stories. This is basically the kind of way I want these seasons to play out. I think that's really undervalued because people look at writers' credits on a television show and thinks that's a reflection of reality. I mean, maybe, I don't know how it is like somebody writing for Doctor Who or something or the EastEnders, but right, two current British hits, right? But it's never been that way in American television. And, you know, as somebody, like, I used to be a big Star Trek obsessive, and I used to read like all the episode guides and Memory Alpha and everything like that. And it was just stunning to me, like, how many people would have their names listed in the credits and basically had almost no involvement in the actual writing of the story. But it's because of the Writers Guild would have these particular rules that are very, very arcane, like this formula about who gets the credit for writing the story. Yeah. I'll give you a great example. Horizon, right? So Chip Johannesson had this basic idea of like somebody who can stop time, right?
Yeah.
That was basically his contribution to that script. I mean, I don't think that he had much involvement with the actual writing of that script, because I think it was like Chris and his guys, you know, like David Amon and that crowd, you know, like they sort of brainstormed on that. I don't think that was basically a Chip Johannesson story at all. So you've got to look at the credits and just sort of take them almost as like, you know, like a guide. Like, this is basically the kind of story I'm going to see. I mean, you did have writers, you know, for instance, the Wongs pretty much worked on their story soup to nuts. You know, they broke the stories themselves and wrote them. And Chris just basically gave them pretty much carte blanche to do what they wanted, except for when they wanted to kill off Hickey or have sleep with some random guy in Philadelphia. then he stepped in. But yeah. But you know, and I know that he just basically left Darren alone to do whatever he wanted to do. You know, probably had some input on some of the banter in some of the earlier episodes. I mean, I can hear Chris's voice in like Humbug and in Clive Bruckman. You know, I can hear like that kind of patter rhythm with the Mulder and Scully dialogue. But you know, the jokes I think are all Darren's, of course. So yeah, you've got to like, because you got to understand that like somebody will come in with an idea and like it's broken in a writer's room, right? I know that like particularly the mythology wasn't, right? But like, so say you would come in and I think actually, what's his name? Guy who wrote Familiar.
Ben Van Allen.
Ben Van Allen, right? But he talked about like the whole way that, you know, in a number of interviews, actually, I think he probably did on the Xcast as well. You know, like you come in with your story ideas and you present them to the room and they just tear them apart, you know, and say, no, do this, do this. So there is much more of a process there. And, you know, particularly, you know, when you have Frank sort of running the show as far as the writers are concerned, and then Chris comes in up until I think the 9th season doing the final rewrite. So it's a whole big process. You know, and one of the things that, you know, Kim Manners had said, you know, Kim Manners said, you go, listen, I don't care who the original writer was. Every one of those scripts was going to go through Chris, and his mark was going to go on every one of those scripts, whether he wrote it or not, you know, quote unquote wrote it. So, and you kind of actually need that, you know, you kind of need somebody who's going to just understand the concept and just put that final polish on it and so on. So anyhow, we're talking about point of view storytelling. See, I don't see Field Trip in that context. I mean, it is, of course it is in a way, but you know, I think that, I think there's sort of a subtext here that if you put Field Trip in the context of the second to last episodes in pretty much all the seasons up to this one, and maybe, well, I mean, arguably including season 7 with the Genie episode.
Yeah, just sweat. Yeah.
I can never pronounce that properly. My French is very poor. So, but you know, you start with like Roland, you know, mind control story, right? And then you have sort of a cult story before Anasazi, and then you have, you know, of course, Wet Wired, and then Demons, and then Folie à Deux, and then Field Trip. You know, so what are all these episodes really kind of about? You know, hallucinations, mind control, drugs, right? So, you know, Roland's being mind controlled by his brother, right? You have the cult and the hallucinations from the Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease and so on. And then Wet Wired, of course, is about mind control and hallucinations, you know, explicitly. as is Demons. I mean, Demons is probably like the most explicit, down to brass tacks MK Ultra episode they ever did. You know, I mean, it's really just pretty much straight up exactly what was going on, and it's still going on, by the way. And then, you know, and then Field Trip. And again, I mean, you can sort of see Je Souhaite as this kind of fantasia and so on and so forth. But it's so clearly divorced from reality. I mean, Je Souhaite is not meant to be seen as something that's actually happening, right? Because like you can't have a character when you're trying to create a real as world as possible. You can't have a character because they'd make everybody on Earth disappear, you know, with a snap of his finger, right? You can't do that. So it's obviously some other kind of stories being told there, right? At least in my opinion. And I think that if you look at this pattern, there are all sort of variations on this theme. And one of the things, you know, I mean, Darren has complimented me for the past 10 years or so on this, but, you know, pointing out that like, you would always have these stories about like hallucinogens and all these kind of things before or after big mythology stories.
Yeah. But
they're always paired, right? So, you know, for instance, the beginning is a big mythology story, and then you have like the mind control story with Drive, right? Yeah. And then, let's see, taking it down the line here. Oh, you know, they sort of show these episodes out of order. So, you know, SR819 was filmed just before, you know, it's right in the production order before Two Fathers, One Son. And that's, you know, that's about using these electronic devices, nanobots and so on to control people. I mean, essentially a form of conscious mind control. So, I mean, you know, it's just like, it started off with like a joke with me. And then like I went through the entire series and just realized that like, oh, wait, every mythology episode, if not necessarily paired with a story about, you know, hallucinogens, like for instance, this story is, has some aspect of like mind control or MK Ultra in it. You know what I mean? There's some part of the program, and you know, MK Ultra is just kind of shorthand for a number of different programs. You know, all the way from like interrogation programs to remote viewing programs. I mean, it's this kind of catchphrase that includes a number of different programs. But the point is that everybody on the writing staff at 1013 was reading this stuff, either of their own volition or because Chris Carter made them. And, you know, the thing that you really start to wonder here, since we're on the cusp of what was meant to be the creation of a new mythology arc, that it starts, that this is what kicks it off. You know, it's kind of like the way that they scheduled, or the way Chris Carter scheduled Demons to be before Gethsemane. So Gethsemane is like this whole storyline about Mulder losing his faith in the paranormal and so on, and not believing in aliens and everything like that. And Chris Carter had scheduled Demons to go before that episode, because if you look at those two back to back, you can kind of say, well, he was still sort of under the influence of the ketamine and the holes being drilled in his skull. You know what I mean? So if he's you know, he's going a little bit off the rails, but you know, I mean, I can't say with absolute authority that that's what they intended to do, but I think you can make a pretty clear inference if you look at the series in aggregate, that they were kind of setting up this alternative explanation for the storyline that nobody wanted to write. Like literally nobody in the writer's room wanted to write the Mulder skeptic storyline, which you can kind of tell by the way it was just very unceremonious, guarded with Patient X and Red and the Black, right? It's just like, do you really have to write this? Because it takes the show out of its natural environment. You know, that the believer skeptic debate here is what was really driving the storylines, right? And without that, you take a lot of the conflict away, and without conflict, you lessen the drama. Okay, so the point is that if you want to understand the series, start to look at the patterns, start to look at the patterns of placement. And if not necessarily air order, maybe look at the production order, because sometimes changes in the production order were forced upon them. So maybe they intended one particular storyline to go before or after or whatever. This, particularly when they get to LA, like there are a lot of logistical things, like a lot of shows end up being shown out of production order because it's like, well, we need to go to Pasadena this weekend, and then we needed to go down to, Orange County next weekend. It's like there's a lot of traveling, so they tried to, combine forces in that regard. But anyway, so the point I'm trying to make is that if you go back to the pilot, and this is why, when I try to tell people, and people always get mad at me when I say this, it's like, no, Samantha was always dead. Samantha was dead from the beginning. She was always dead, right? Because what drove Mulder, and the FBI profiler in Closure says this. It's like, he got into all this X-Files stuff to sort of cope with this trauma, this like really crushing trauma that he never got over, and he was going to like destroy him if he couldn't find a way to channel it. So just go back to the teaser of the pilot, and it's a girl showing up dead in the forest in her nightgown.
Yeah.
Okay. And then what we have soon after that, or a few acts after that, is Mulder talking about his sister disappearing. Now, do you really think that that's accidental? Do you really think that, like, when you're writing your pilot, this is your big shot, this is your big chance, this is your big break, do you think you just, particularly a guy who's as weird and fractal and, sees all these weird connections like Chris Carter does, connections that, even I don't see, that he's just going to leave it up to chance? No, what he's saying is that, what was happening in the forest happened to Mulder's sister. It's the exact same thing, right? See, but now here's the other interesting thing, because when I was working on my notes for this show today, I was thinking, oh wait, okay, so they're in the forest, right? And then there's all this weird ash, this weird dust, and what do we see in Field Trip? Scully going out to the mountain and like this weird dust. See, I don't think that's coincidence, and they left a lot of this stuff hanging because they wanted you to figure stuff out for yourself. But I think what the inference is in the pilot is that what Chris Carter is doing is that he's showing like there's this big eugenics program going on. Super soldiers, mind control, eugenics. I mean, you name it. Just like this whole big government program to change humanity. Like to just basically change humanity, like create a slave race, on and on and on, right? And like these kids were chosen as test subjects for this. And maybe like they're all drugged or abducted or whatever happened to them, like out in the woods, like, because that's where it all starts, right? We were partying out in the woods, so on and so forth. So it's like, this is baked into the pilot. Yeah. If you really watch the pilot, right, what is it really about? Because we have no reason to believe that any of this is aliens. Why would we believe it's aliens? I mean, because in the very next episode, we see, human beings flying around in quote unquote UFOs, right? So I think that this is all very deliberate. And I think Chris Carter will never cop to this because he doesn't want to he doesn't want to spill the beans. But if you look at the pilot in Deep Throat, it's both about technology, mind control, drugs, all this kind of stuff, right? Mental hospitals, everything like that, because the pilot is in the mental hospital and that's why he went missing and so on. And like, what do we see? Like Mulder just like, that's what I keep saying to people. It's just like, it's right there out in front of you. Like people go, oh, you're crazy. Like, I'm like, no, like the whole series is about like them just chasing around these like rejects from like these super soldier and genetics programs, and they're like programmed to think that's all aliens because that's how they're kept in line. That sort of assuages their consciences, and that's why. And you see that exactly in unnatural suspects, right, or unusual suspects, right? Yeah. So this is really. I mean, I can't say that this is like consciously the real true meaning and through line of this series. It's a lot of episodes, right? Over 200 episodes of television. But I'm telling you, these guys were thinking about this, particularly Chris Carter. And if you start to really look at these episodes, you're going to understand like what he's trying to really tell you the stories about. Great example, Dwayne Barry Ascension, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a big mythology thing, but Dwayne Barry is being mind controlled. And what do we see just before that? Sleepless, which is about the military and mental hospitals and mind control. And this is just complete, this just repeats over and over again throughout the entire series, starting at the very first episode. And everybody thinks I'm crazy, because I am, but also because like people haven't really like kind of processed this. But I'm telling you, man, if you really sit down and look at these episodes and just really break down what they're really about, it's like, oh my God, that's what this is really about. It's about these two people who are being programmed to hunt down like escapees or rejects or whatever of these genetics programs. And they're programmed to think that they're chasing monsters and aliens and all this other kind of stuff. So they won't feel like complete and total, criminals, they won't feel like just murderers. Like I'm telling you, like you think, well, that's like, come on, Chris. I know you're crazy and you got a lot of crazy fan theories, but that's just like one step too far. But it isn't, man. It's like in the series from the beginning. And that's why you always see like Mulder and Scully and so on and so forth ending up in like the hospital for random reasons. And everybody thinks they're dead. And then they miraculously revive over and over and over again, because that's them going in to get their programming refreshed. And I'm telling you, man, if you look at this series, so I think, well, I'm calling it a series, but it's, group of storylines here, but if you look at Field Trip and then Field Trip, which is preceding the big 3-parter, right?
Yeah.
Which ends up with what? Mulder being in the hospital, having his program refreshed again, right? So I think that really, I don't know how conscious it was. My guess would be it was very conscious, but it's like, Mulder and Scully are like going to be thrown into this new adventure. There's all this stuff going on. There's all this stuff going on with these weird spaceships and everything. And like, they need to have their program refreshed because they've been getting a little stroppy, they've been getting a little too big for their boots. So it's like, if you look at Field Trip, it's like, they're not actually going into this cave with this giant hallucinogenic mushroom that like eats its victims. No, what they're doing is they're going into the friggin' hospital. And that's why they meet the guy in the white robe, the Jim Beaver, my man, Bobby Singer, shout out. Why they see they go into the hospital and they meet the guy with that's their doctor, man. That's not a pathologist. That's their doctor. And I'm telling you, man, it's like, that's all in their mind because they're getting like their programming refreshed. And you think, oh my God, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard. It's like, yeah, well, it is, but go watch. I'm not the guy who wrote it, right? So go watch it. And I'm telling you, so I've been saying this stuff for years. So, and the other important thing about this is that this really leads, when my work really started, when I started noticing that starting with this particular storyline, that they were incorporating the myths of Isis and Osiris, particularly as written by Plutarch. So, and I did this big thing. I did this big webpage back in, I think 2004, 2005, and Frank linked to it on his Big Light thing. And it kind of just basically started everything because I was just watching, I've been reading a lot of this mythology and I was watching these episodes over and over again. I'm like, wait a minute, this is Isis and Osiris. This is exactly what it is. And so people think, oh, it's like Last Temptation of Christ and everything like that. But that's just a red herring. No, if you look at and I wrote this down, and I should probably republish this in some form because I was very meticulous about showing you the exact allegory. But the other thing about Isis and Osiris too is that that's the mystery cults. What are the mystery cults? The mystery cults are basically drug cults. So it's all connected. It's all tied in together. And I'll tell you something. You all know that I am not a fan of season 10 by any stretch of the imagination. Yes. I've made no secret of that, right? or of harsh realm. Let me just add that in. I always like to I like to kick harsh realm when it's down. But but I'll tell you, Babylon, I swear to God, I was like, oh my God, Chris Carter wrote this for me. You know what I mean? Like he had seen all this stuff. I mean, he knows me. You know, so I'm not like, so like the Beatles are sending in mind rays through the radio into my head. I know. I mean, Chris Carter knows me. He knew what I wrote, right? He knew I wrote the book and the X-Files. You know, I interviewed him. You know, he knew who I was. Frank had read, you know, my whole Isis Osiris thing. So it's not like some mystery to these guys. You know, it's like I'm not like some weird guy like trapped in a basement somewhere thinking that, you know, I'm being mind controlled by Chris Carter. But when I saw that, I'm like, oh my God, because if you watch, listen, Babylon's a really bad episode, but at the same time, it's so fascinating. It's so interesting because it's just like, it's so crazy. And he's just piling this stuff on, but it's just like, this is exactly what I'm talking about. Like the drugs and the psychics, you know, like the psychic powers coming from the ingestion of these hallucinogens, and then like the whole big thing that I've been talking to you a number of times about, which is the voyage to the underworld, the descent into the underworld. Yeah, which at every one of these mystery cults, that is the center. You know, whether it's Isis and Osiris, Demeter and Persephone, Orpheus and Eurydice, Inanna and Tammuz. I mean, whoever up and down the line, it's always about this descent into the underworld. And I'm not exactly, I mean, a lot of different people have a lot of different opinions on what that really means. But I will just tell you straight out that all these like mystery cults that I've been talking about, that is the fundamental part of the ritual, is this descent into the underworld. And that's exactly what he's showing in Babylon. It could not possibly be more explicit than that. You know, you understand what I'm saying? He could not possibly make it more explicit than that. And, you know, listen, that's a weird, crazy, like, what the hell was he possibly thinking? Like, this was a good idea to put on television in 2016. But at the same time, I'm really glad he did, because it just validated every one of my theories. You know, people who probably listen to this podcast, like that most of them probably don't understand what I'm talking about. Like, they're not familiar with this very weird and esoteric mythology. But I'm just telling you, I've been talking about this for a long time, almost 20 years now. And like, there it is in Babylon, which probably is not a lot to brag about, but there it is anyway. And it just repeats over and over and over and over and over again. So the thing that I was really fascinated about, so field trip precedes biogenesis. What is biogenesis? Dr. Sandoz. I keep telling people this all the time. Sandoz is the name of the company that first created LSD. It's a guy named Albert Hoffman was experimenting with, I think, with ergo from rye, and accidentally dosed himself with LSD. Okay. So he worked for Sandoz Pharmaceuticals, originally based out of Basel. I think it was Basel, somewhere in Switzerland, whatever. Switzerland, yeah. Yeah, it was Switzerland. But anyway, so the point is like, so this is exactly what I'm saying. So you have this whole episode about like the field trip, right? And then the very next episode is Dr. Sandoz and his tablets that are giving Mulder bad trips. Because listen, I don't know how many people who listen to the show have ever had experience with hallucinogens, LSD, whatever. I don't know how many people have had like an experience with a bad trip or whatever. But that's exactly what this episode is about. It's not about like alien mind rays or whatever. It's like Mulder has a bad trip when he's exposed to Sandoz's tablets. I mean, it's like, come on, man. It could not possibly be more explicit. It's like right in your face. And then he goes down to like, New Mexico. And that's really where it all started for Chris, because so let me tell you how when this stuff really became really explicit in the X-Files. Okay. So it starts off with that. There's all the MK Ultra stuff where, you know, I think he's basically, this is my opinion, but I think he's just basically trying to say like all this UFO stuff, it's all just MK Ultra shenanigans, right? But then they do shapes. And so a native wrote to him and, you know, was criticizing like all the thing they showed as far as like Indian burial practices and stuff like that. Yeah. So he went out to I think Sedona, maybe it was Sedona, and partook in the peyote ritual.
Yep.
So it's like, how many television producers? Well, I'm sure a lot of television producers, partake in peyote rituals, or much, and then some, right? But how many would admit it? Like, how many would say, like, that's part of their PR campaign? It's like, hey, man, I went out, hung out with a Navajo, and took part in a peyote ritual, and now I'm going to start writing that into my storylines, right? Like, who would admit to that, right? So it's like this. None of this is not like just pure conjecture on my part. It's like there's so much of this stuff deliberately and explicitly written into these storylines, and then you have like basically him saying these things out loud. But anyway, so it's like, how does it become more explicit than this? But like you're never going to have like a storyline like this when it's so explicit that this is about hallucinogens and so on, that's what it's really about. See, this is what I'm saying. I don't think that's the text, right? But the subtext is like Mulder and Scully getting their programming refreshed. Maybe they're taking off to Fort Detrick or something, or Fort Marlene, right? Fort Marlene, and just getting a fresh wrench, right? Because what happens exactly after Field Trip is like Mulder just starts to freak out when that whole thing shows up with the rubbing from the tablets and so on and everything like that. Yeah. So, and then, but again, this all ties in. If that 7th and 8th season arc, that myth arc, it almost point for point follows this ancient mythology, right? But that's not anything new. I mean, people have been stealing ideas from ancient mythology, since the days of ancient mythology, right? So that's not especially surprising to see that they would write the storyline being lifted from ancient myths. I mean, that's just the way things are done. But I just think it's really fascinating to see, like, it's the ancient myths plus the UFOs plus the hallucinogens plus the MK Ultra, because this is all stuff that was very much germinating in that sort of information underground of like BBS boards and Usenet and fanzines and newsletters, just this whole alternative culture. These things were really being processed at that time, because this is not too long after, well, I guess at this point in time, you would have a lot of the information about like human experimentation, radiation experiments, and all that stuff came out. And I guess that was during the Clinton era, and also the remote viewing program was shut down by Congress, I think in 94. So that's during the Clinton era. So it's just all these things are going on, and it's all feeding into these storylines. But I think that there's another subtext here, because this is going to lead into, to biogenesis. Mm-hmm. And, so it's like Mulder needs to be hospitalized because he needs some fresh infusions. And like with Scully, like her programming's a little different. They got to put on this big display. So why don't we just take her out to Africa and show her the spaceship, which is either real or manufactured? It doesn't really matter to her, right? But, but do you see what I'm saying? And then that leads into the sixth extinction. But the thing that's so fascinating to me, and believe me, I have looked and I've never been able to figure out why this happened. And I sort of had this mandate when I was, when I interviewed Chris, that I couldn't really go into the mythology stuff, even though I did, right? Even though I did. But, I think it was like he didn't want to get into mythology with me because he knew what I was going to ask him, right? So, right? So, but anyway, but then, like this whole thing with biogenesis, and that, they start to make the ancient astronaut stuff more explicit, even though Chris Carter had said that, that was baked into the series from the beginning, with that speech, when Deep Throat says they've been here, a long time. Yeah. Exactly. Right. Yeah. And, so the other thing that, I wanted just to go back when I'm talking about this harebrained theory of mine, but Mulder is wearing a Georgetown shirt, that scene, so he's jogging around the track and he meets up with Deep Throat, and he's wearing the Georgetown shirt, right? And why would he be wearing that? He doesn't really have any connection that we know of to Georgetown. But, and this is Chris Carter here, Georgetown was where MK Ultra doctors were experimenting with memory erasure. Like there were specific programs being done at Georgetown University to erase people's memories. So that's, I think, Like that's what I'm talking about. Chris Carter's fractal brain, right? And so here's another thing. So, getting back to improbable, I'm jumping around a bit here, but it's a lot of ground I want to cover. So, we're talking about improbable, right? Obviously not a real story, obviously some sort of fantasy at the very least, but he puts in all the music from Naples. What is it? But the interesting thing about Naples is that Naples was known as like the numerology capital of Europe for a long, like numerology was a big thing in Naples. So he's doing the storyline on numerology, right, for Improbable. And then he's using music, current pop music, the music that comes from like what was considered to be the world capital of numerology.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? So it's like, this is what just endlessly fascinates, somebody who's got I've got really, really bad OCD. So I obsess on things and I'm always just hyper obsessing on these things, but it's like, I'm rewarded for it because there are just so many layers and they just packed in so much information and so much subtext. There's so much subtext in the series that is never outwardly addressed, that they never acknowledge, publicly at least, cop up to. It's always something like it. And Kim Manners had said, like, you're supposed to figure it out. Like they want you to do the work. They don't want to explain everything to you. They want you to do the work. And I think that just sort of reaches its limit. I think certainly by this point in the series run, people just got tired of trying to figure out what this was and that was and this was. It gets to be exhausting. You've got to sort of wrap things up at some point. But so what we see here is that there's this new mythology that they wanted to get into. They wanted to get into this whole ancient aliens kind of deal and all that kind of thing, several years before the TV show and so on. And actually this is a period in time when this stuff was this stuff was interesting and popular to people in the underground, but this is like 25, 30 years after Chariots of the Gods and another 20 years before Ancient Aliens. So this is like kind of an outlier here, but the way that they tie it in with the hallucinogens and the mystery cult symbolism and so on, I just believe me, man, this stuff ruined my life. It really did. And, it's just just too many mysteries for me to solve here. And, again, if you're not familiar with the source material, it's going to go right over your head, but it's all there. I'm telling you, man. And then of course we had Kitten, right, in the 11th season when they're talking about MK and Naomi. So it's like, you think that this is a crazy theory, right? But it's only a crazy theory if you don't look at the series in aggregate and kind of look behind the scenes of a lot of these things that they're referencing. For instance, MK Naomi, right? For instance, Sandoz, right? I mean, how many people knew? I mean, I for years I thought his name was Dr. Sanders. You know what I mean? And then I look it up and it's like Sandoz. I'm like, are you friggin' kidding me? It's Sandoz, right? So, I mean, but, so here's the interesting thing, just tie it in. So let's just get back to the whole thing with season 6, right? So season 6 is kind of the last of the glory days, right? The next season, the ratings are going to really start to dip. The show is really going to start to lose its luster with the critics. You're going to have a lot of these very weak novelty episodes like Marlene and Goldberg Variation. And, the tone is kind of all over the place, where you go from something like Thief and then to, as you said, Joshua and everything. The tone is, it's just like fits and starts. There's no, for all the faults that I would find with season 6, at least they sort of grouped together all the X-Files light stuff together. And I think when they spread it out in the season, first of all, there's just way too much of it, right? But, it just doesn't work. And if you listen to the, this is another aside, but if you listen to the commentary track on, I guess it's either on, maybe it's on Jose Chung, but Darren Morgan and Rob Bowman do a commentary track together. And it's
That's
really
Jose Chung, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, and the funny thing is that Rob Bowman doesn't really seem very happy to be doing it. I don't think he really liked Darren Morgan that much. But at the end, Darren Morgan and sort of, he was talking about he was always struggling with oh, this joke's too broad, you got to tone it down. And he said, by the end, by season 6, they would have had like one of those big timpanis going boing. And it's true, it's just like the humor just gets so broad. And I think the broader the humor gets, to me, the less funny it gets, because it just takes everything out of its context. So anyway, very fraught, a lot of hard work. Again, everybody's just working so hard, working around the clock. David and Jillian are becoming less and less shy of, talking to the press about how tired they are, and they're just sick of doing the show, and they're sick of the characters, and they just want to do something else because they're just exhausted. And then you have biogenesis leading into sixth extinction and Amor Fati. So I think there's something really interesting that happens, because I think this sort of speaks to the dynamic, particularly in the context of season 7, when David is suing Fox and then names Chris as co-defendant and so on and so forth. So we have biogenesis. So it's clear to everybody, all right, they're done with the whole colonization storyline, at least with the syndicate and so on. They're going to start this new storyline, right? And everybody thought, oh, this is new, this is exciting, And I tell you, that last scene in biogenesis, when like Scully's like
very good,
looking like, what the fuck, and then she's like standing, and you're like, they zoom out and you see this big spaceship, and you hear like these big chords, Mark Snow just hitting these big like sort of chords. It almost reminds me like the Exodus soundtrack, and and you think, oh damn, it's getting real, right? And then like biogenesis sort of like carries that over, and there's also another specific kind of drug cult. So there's a specific connection with the Ivory Coast and drug cults that we don't have to talk about now. And all of a sudden, like the story just completely changes track with Amor Fati. So it's like you have the scenes that Chris is obviously writing, between like Diana Fowley and Scully and so on.
Yep.
And then there's this whole weird extended fantasy, this is your life kind of thing going on. And everybody thought that was Last Temptation of Christ, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there certainly are similarities, with like Mary Magdalene and so on. But, I had pointed out to you several years ago, no, this is really comes straight from the Invaders.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people don't realize it, but it was actually David Duchovny who suggested to Chris that they hire Roy Thinnes.
Uh-huh.
That was David's idea, which I think is really interesting. So I think David was clearly watching that show, because I think he took a lot from Roy Thinnes's performances. If you go back and watch the Invaders, right? And then watch Mulder, I'm telling you, man, a lot of similarities.
Right.
Very much, because Roy Thinnes in that series was very deadpan, very understated, you know what I mean? Like cool, calm and collected. And I think that that was a huge influence on David's performances, because if you look some of the earlier performances, particularly early on in the first season, he's this kind of like doofy character, and like Chris had him like if like a MTV video host was a FBI agent, right? It's like, so 90s, right? But I think that David took huge chunks of style from Roy Thinnes. But people, if you want to see like the real origin of Amor Fati and like the non like sort of highbrow, like this is the lowbrow truth behind the highbrow myth, right? But that sequence is taken directly from an episode called The Innocent. And, even like the cigarette smoking man has his direct parallel with a character played by Michael Rennie, who some of you might remember from The Day the Earth Stood Still. So,
of course, yeah.
Yeah. So go back and watch that, because it's the same thing, like meets the old friend, meets the old, the friend that thought met an unfortunate end or whatever, and he's okay, and then the old girlfriend shows. It's the same storyline. It's just so funny, and I think only lunatics like me would point that out. But anyway, it totally derails. Like the momentum is just totally stopped in its tracks, because you're expecting like, oh crap, what's this spaceship going to do? What is it going to do to people? What kind of effect is it going to have on people? And on and on and on. And then it just kind of just like, whatever.
Yeah.
David wants to have like, this little fantasy sequence, I mean, I love that episode. Don't get me wrong. And I one of my favorite, Yeah, it was one of my favorite episodes for a long time. But now I kind of see it like, why did this happen? And then like, we don't see that storyline picked up until when? Season 9.
Providence and
after
Providence.
David leaves. So do you think the timing there is significant in any way? You know what I mean? Like all of a sudden, like the storyline is picked up back again, like after David leaves, and it was sort of like derailed midstream when David was still around. But I think the tell here is Hollywood AD. Now, as much as I don't love The Unnatural, I love Hollywood AD.
Mm-hmm.
I really do. I think I'm one of the only people who genuinely loves that episode. But I think what he was doing in that episode is that my feeling, and I probably need to maybe talk to Frank about this, but I think what they want to do, starting with the sixth extinction, was do a like sort of a zombie apocalypse storyline. And they sort of touched upon it a little in Millennium, and then it just kind of dropped. And it probably dropped for a number of reasons, but I think David thought it was really stupid. And I think that's why he does Hollywood AD, which is Hollywood after David, i.e. X-Files after David. Like they're just going to do this stupid storyline about zombies. Because if you watch Hollywood AD, it's so clearly, particularly riffing on biogenesis, because you have Chuck Burke show up and he's like oohing and ahhing about these like fragments. And he's like, oh, this is the voice of Jesus, I'm the walrus and all this kind of stuff. So I think that David was very consciously and specifically lampooning this aborted zombie apocalypse storyline, because what does sixth extinction kind of end up with? And it ends up with Dr. Barnes being killed by a zombie, right? Now, the interesting thing about that is that Dr. Barnes was the name of the professor in the TV show ISIS from the 1970s with Joanne Cameron. And I always thought that was really interesting, because one of the things I did in my big opus back in 2004 was show how they were doing all these shout outs to the TV show ISIS while they were doing this whole allegory of Isis and Osiris by Plutarch. You see what I'm saying? So it's like, if you know the background material, I'm telling you, man, it's like, if you know what they're really saying here, and I can watch an episode 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 200-300 times, right? And all of a sudden it's like, oh shit, that's what it is, right? It's just like, it suddenly occurs to me like 25 years later, it's like, oh shit, that's what they were doing, right? So there was something going on. I think it had a lot to do with the lawsuit. I think they really wanted to keep David happy. I think they wanted to make sure that he was going to do his 8 episodes the next season, and then his semi episodes or his cameo appearances, whatever the formula was. They just wanted to keep him happy. So I think that's maybe why A, they canned the zombie apocalypse storyline, and B, picked up the storyline again after he had definitively left the show. And another thing that I guess I've said on the boards a few times, but I'll say again, for posterity here, is that I really think that Scully's fertility was restored by the spaceship.
Yeah, that's good.
Do you remember that? Do you remember that scene? Like Dr. Braun comes in with a bag of fish, and all of a sudden they're alive. I think that's pretty heavy-handed, sort of like film school 101, like the womb and the little swimming fellas going around in there. You get the inference there. I don't want to get too explicit, but I think that's pretty direct. I've always thought that her fertility is restored, and of course, longtime listeners will know that I do not regard 10 and 11 as canon. I see them as sort of like apocryphal storylines. So I've never been too concerned about the CGB arc and William and so on. But I will say this. So one of the things that I think is another thing that they never said out loud, but I think you see baked into the series almost from day one, certainly by Beyond the Sea, Scully is psychic, and the Scully women are psychic. Like Ma Scully, Scully, and Missy were all psychic. And that's why, they cut that scene. And I might have said this on your show before, when they cut that scene from The Blessing Way, where Melissa comes in and like, oh, you think he's dead, but he's not dead and everything. And then, there's this whole big blow up between her and Scully. And I was like, why did they cut that scene? It's such a great scene. And it's like, if they didn't cut that scene, it would just put this entire series in a whole new light, that Scully is psychic. And that's why she has the visions in that episode of like Mulder. And that's why she has the visions of the spaceship in Within or Without.
Oh, yeah.
Both, both. But you see this throughout the series where Scully has these visions, paperclip and so on. She has all these visions, and she has this like psychic link with Mulder. And what I would argue, since it's apocryphal and it doesn't matter anyway, it's just basically very expensive fanfic. But I would argue that Williams saw Cigarette Smoking Man through Scully's eyes. Okay. So Scully had all these anxieties, these deep set anxieties about his birth that we saw, very, very, this is one thing I get a little annoyed with fans sometimes, because it's like, oh, this was just came out of the blue and this is total retconning. It's like, did you watch Nothing Important Happened Today? 1 and 2? I mean, granted, those are chores to get through and they're pretty terrible, but it's like, it's pretty much well established that Scully, at least one explanation that Scully is part of this super soldier program that, Ghoulie revives, right? Ghoulie starts talking about it again. And that she was never really certain about William's birth throughout the entire 9th season, because she couldn't be sure whether it was, a natural birth because of Mulder or is because of this program that was going on. And this starts, this whole thing starts in that scene that I love so much, that scene in Existence between Doggett and Noel Rohrer, which, oh my God, I just think that is one of the best. That to me is as good as the scene between Scully and Well Manicured Man in Blessing Way. Like I have as high a regard for that scene as I do as the scene in The Blessing Way, or any other, the great scene in Redux 2 between, Mulder and the cigarette smoking man on the street. It's just like, I just think that is such a phenomenal scene. And that would be like, I can just see that scene in like some 70s movie, like some conspiracy movie from the 70s. But anyway, or maybe like the Osterman Weekend or something. But I just, I get a little annoyed because they spent an entire season and arguably, per annum, maybe they spent 2 seasons sort of establishing this uncertainty about the nature of Scully's pregnancy. And then all of a sudden, everybody in season 11 is like, oh my God, where did this come from? Oh, this is an outrage. It's like, well, maybe it isn't. Maybe you just weren't really paying attention because you didn't like those series, those seasons. You know what I mean? Maybe you should have paid better attention. Even if you didn't like it, you just sort of like be kept up to date. It doesn't matter because again, none of that actually happened, but, but it was discussed at great length in 2 separate seasons of the X-Files. So I just don't understand why, people would be so sandbagged by it. But anyway, so the point I'm trying to make here, and I know you probably want to get rid of me, but the point I'm trying to make here is that if you look at Field Trip not as reality, but as like this weird hallucination they're both having, and maybe it's a shared hallucination, you know what I mean? Like maybe it's like this weird psychic link.
It becomes that, doesn't it? It definitely becomes a shared thing by the end of the episode, I think.
Yeah, well, oh God, that's that scene with like in his apartment and the alien in his bedroom. It's like I literally have goosebumps right now. I love that scene so much. But so here's another interesting thing, getting back to Field Trip. So not only do we have the great Bobby Singer playing Mulder and Scully's MK Ultra technician, we have Wallace Schiff, right? So 2 great things that I think are really hilarious about this. David Denman, who plays Wallace Schiff, is in one of my favorite movies of all time. And if I don't think anybody's heard of this movie, and if you haven't heard of it, you really got to see it. This movie called The Nines. Have you ever seen The Nines?
No, I don't know that.
Okay, It was written by John August, who's basically Tim Burton's favorite screenwriter. He had written like Big Fish and a bunch of those other Tim Burton movies. He wrote the movie Go back in the 90s. He wrote a bunch of stuff. I think he wrote Batman. What was the second Batman called?
with Michelle Pfeiffer, Batman Returns, that one.
Yeah, okay. He did a lot of ghostwriting of Batman Returns. So anyway, John August, he wrote this movie called The Nines, and it stars, and this is the funny thing because the cast is amazing. It's Hope Davis, Ryan Reynolds, and Melissa McCarthy are the three main stars in it. You know, pretty top-rate acting talent there, right?
Yeah.
So he plays one of the main supporting characters in it. So seriously, if you get anything from this whole delirious rant of mine, go watch The Nines. It is a phenomenal movie. You will love it. It's just great. Anyway, but Walsh and Schiff are both names of pharmaceutical companies, right? So we talked about Dr. Sandoz, and Dr. Sandoz is like Sandoz Pharmaceuticals and LSD and so on, right? But Walsh and Schiff are both names of big pharmaceutical companies, which I just think is so hilarious because it's just like, this is what I'm talking about. If you go beneath the surface and like pay attention to the semiotics, right? Like what are the semiotics of this? They're telling you exactly what's going on here. You know what I mean? So it's like they meet up with their technician, their brain control technician, and he's like, oh, you know, stripped and skeletonized, acid, blah, 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 blah. Right. And then everybody repeats that throughout the, you know, like the lone gunmen repeat it and so on and so forth. Like that's repeated almost like a mantra, right? This whole quote unquote pathologist report. I think that's listen, I could be totally wrong here, but I think that's one of the hints that this is actually not real, that this is like a programming session. And just the fact that sort of the linchpin of this is this guy, Wallace Schiff, whose name is constructed out of the, you know, names of two pharmaceutical companies. It just seems like a little too much of a stretch to me, you know. I haven't really looked into Brown Mountain yet. That might just be a sort of a pretext, but there you go. I mean, I don't want to burst anyone's bubble. If you want to believe it's all about aliens and, you know, monsters and mutants, be my guest. But I'm just telling you, I think there's a pretty compelling argument to be made that what they're really saying is that this is about this program, eugenics and mind control and so on and so forth.
Just to be devil's advocate for a second, if you're saying that the people who are writing the series, making the series, would never cop to this, and you're not saying that this is actually what's happening on the text of the story, this is happening at a subtextual level. So I guess it could never be proven or disproven, could it, by that kind of logic?
Well, it depends on what your standard of proof is. For me, it was beyond any semblance of doubt,
right,
when I saw Babylon. But I'll tell you something. Even I Want to Believe. So I Want to Believe, right?
Yeah.
He had talked about how he had gotten the original inspiration from this from a Houston Smith lecture. Houston Smith is one of these big sort of, well, he's a theologian and sort of a religious philosopher in a lot of different ways, but he's also one of these big like mushroom guys.
Right.
And he wrote like a lot of books and gave a lot of lectures on like the religious benefits of psychedelic hallucinogenic mushrooms. And I'll tell you something else. I mean, this is something that when I first heard what the plot line, you know, the body parts being scattered all over the place, I was like, oh my God, that's the search for Osiris. Because in Osiris, you know, the storyline that I talk about, Isis and Osiris storyline, Isis and her sister Nephthys like travel the world trying to find his body parts because, you know, his arch enemy Set has him dismembered and has the body parts scattered. And the only thing they don't find is the schwang. So, I mean, maybe you could, I don't know, make some sort of inference with the plot twist at the end of that movie. So, but it's like, I'm telling you, man, and when you look at, say, something like Irresistible. So like Irresistible, to me, is almost like Chris Carter telling you exactly what the series is about and using that professor of mythology. Like people actually take night classes in mythology.
Oh, yeah.
Like, people go to community colleges to take night courses in like mythology. It's like, no, they don't. I mean, you know, no, I mean, Chris Carter knows that nobody does that, right? So let me just, I want to read this to you because I think this is like Chris Carter's voice. This is him telling you what he's doing, what he's really up to. And it's like in Bellfleur, you know, it's like Bellfleur University or something like that, or Contra Costa, somewhere down around where he grew up. So anyway, the teacher goes, the necessity of the story, the myth or the legend in a culture is almost universal. We think of myths as things that entertain or instruct, but their deeper purpose is often to explain or make fanciful wishes, desires, or behavior that society would otherwise deem unacceptable. Myths often disguise thoughts that are simply too terrible to think about because they are conveyed in a wrapping of untruth, the story. These thoughts become harmless fiction. And then he continues, take, for example, stories that we recite for children, such as Snow White or Alice in Wonderland. The subtextual themes where the queen orders off with her head or the prince wakens Sleeping Beauty with a kiss are what Freud would describe as death wish imagining. So to me, it's like, this is Chris Carter saying, listen, this is what I'm really doing here. I'm taking these science fiction tropes because there are other ideas that I want to explore that would never pass muster on network television. Like I honestly think because the reason I think that is that you'll see, we've discussed this before, Zeus, Pandora, Demeter. I mean, he'll put these little hints, like drop these little breadcrumbs over the entire series. And again, like I said, if you're familiar with Plutarch's Isis and Osiris, if you're not, go read it. It's a very, it's very readable. It's not dry or corny or anything. It's a very readable story. It's actually very entertaining. But if you go read that story and then say, okay, well, how does this line up with the X-Files? You're going to see that like they were following it really closely. You know what I mean? And then throwing in these little, I'll tell you a great example of one of the things they throw in. When we first, let's call the boy in the beach William, because to me, he's clearly William. He's a foreshadowing of William, right? I mean, you agree with that, right? The boy in the beach.
Yes, that's how I
see
it. Yes.
That's another reason why I think Scully had her fertility restored on the beach, because he's the boy on the beach. You get it, right? The boy, like Back to the Beach, okay, I think you understand what I'm saying here. But when we see him, he has like the sun behind his head as a halo. And if you look at images of the Egyptian god Horus, he wears the sun as a crown, like the sun is his crown. Do you understand what I'm saying? So it's like he's being crowned with the sun, like quite explicitly, And if you look at the shape of that, the spaceship, right? It's the sort of the classic circle within the triangle. Yeah. You know what I mean? So that is actually, I won't go into the details of it, but that's actually stellar symbolism. That's actually a star map. But, it's sort of come down as sort of like what the eye in the triangle or the eye of the Illuminati or whatever. I mean, people don't know what they're talking about, but, that's how it's entered the popular lexicon, right? But that's how it's shaped, right? So, yeah, I mean, listen, if they want to come and sue me for saying this is all like deliberate allegory, God love them. I don't have two dimes to rub together, so good luck. But no, I obviously don't think they would do that. But I really think that like the myth, forget all the MK Ultra stuff for a minute. But I think the mythological encoding is just way too consistent, way too detailed, and way too extensive from soup to nuts to possibly be anything but intentional.
No, I think it's fascinating. I think I struggle to see a world where it ever becomes the dominant reading of the series.
Well, I don't want to live in that world. I want to live in the world where I'm the rebel, man. I know the truth. You believe the official story, man? I know the truth. Hell with you. I'm punk rock. Listen,
Chris freaking Knowles. Yeah.
Listen, punk rocker, OG punk rocker back in the day, never left me. Cursed me forever. But you gotta play the cards you're given.
Chris, I think maybe we should stop there. I think, people need time to process all this.
Yeah.
We'll revisit this someday, I'm sure. What are you up to online? Can you tell us, you're on Twitter these days and all that?
Let me tell you what I'm up to now. I'll tell you one of the things if you really want some fun and excitement. And particularly, your listeners, I'm doing, it's a series called Insanely Great 90s Songs You're Not Sick of or You're Not Tired of. And I'm making these playlists and actually readers of mine are putting together Spotify versions of this. But I'm going through each year of the 90s and finding all the songs that people haven't grown completely sick of and it's very U.S. centric. I mean, I do put a lot of UK stuff in there, but I think it's a little more, North American centric than not. But I'm real excited about it. It's my Secret History of Rock and Roll blog. So if you just look up Secret History of Rock and Roll blog, and then my name, you'll come to it pretty quickly. But I'm having a blast doing this. As of this recording, I'm up to 1994, and I'll be working on 1995 today and tomorrow. But I'm really excited about it. And also my book, The Endless American Midnight, which I have been absolutely shocked by the response I've gotten from it. It's just been incredibly gratifying. People have really responded very well to that, and which I did not expect at all, I will add. And that's a good place to start. I will say this for the record. I will go on the record now. I am also currently working on a book compiling all my insane X-Files fan theories.
Oh, very good.
And I have absolutely I have zero commercial expectations of this, but I just, I want to put this out there for the record. And then you can sort of, I'm going to try to make them as cogent and coherent as I can, as opposed to this diatribe you were just subjected to. It's going to be a lot of fun, and I think when I sort of lay things out for you, soup to nuts, I think you'll see it, and I will guarantee that it will make you want to go back and rewatch these episodes, and you will have an entirely new appreciation of the genius of the series, because I just think this is a level of genius that I can't think of a parallel for, certainly not on television.
Right. Cheers, Chris. So we've done this episode now, and the next episode will be myself and Darren and Kurt discussing biogenesis. You can find the Xcast in all the usual places, at the X_cast on Twitter, find us on Facebook. That's all for today, though, listeners. So until next time, always remember, trust no one.
Elsewhere on We Made This. Shipwrecked and Comatose, a Red Dwarf podcast.
We are into our specials between Series 3 and Series 4, and I am your regular host, Mark. With me at this time, you're not Kurt.
What, Shipwrecked and Comatose? What's Red Dwarf? Who's Kurt?
Oh dear. Hello, Fraser.
Hello, Mark. How's it going?
So this is our very special, right in the childhood, Shipwrecked and Comatose crossover.
Whoa, 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 whoa. Crossing the streams. They tell you not to do that in Ghostbusters. But then that's what actually saves the day. So maybe we should cross the streams.
We are Starfleet.
A lot of times we have trouble facing profound grief and trauma in our past. So it is interesting. I think it was this sort of well-intentioned, sort of benchmark for him to clear as a developing being, and he unfortunately kind of had this arrested development because of the trauma that he experienced. And then, if someone had shown up a year later, 2 years later, maybe not so bad. But the burn happened, and that wasn't an option anymore.
Pick a disc.
So yeah, I do think that concept of just like normal music getting associated with Christmas is much more of a British thing, which I find interesting. The Love Actually soundtrack, I mean, this might be entirely because of how much I like Love Actually and how much I associate it with Christmas, but definitely like Jump for My Love, or even Too Lost in You, to be honest, because Sugar Babes weren't big in the US like whatsoever. So I know them from this song, and I know this song from Love Actually, that I do think when I hear that, my head does kind of go to Christmas time. But I don't know if that's just more of me than normal people.
Check out all of these shows and more on the We Made This podcast network. The Xcast and X-Files podcast was created by Tony Black. and is produced and hosted by Carl Sweeney, Sarah Blair, and Kurt North.
You can find the podcast on Twitter at the X_cast, on Facebook by typing in the Xcast, and in our group, X-Files Basement, the Xcast podcast fan group, and on Instagram at the Xcast Pod.
Don't forget, you can support the show by becoming a member on Patreon. Our patrons get early access to episodes, behind-the-scenes chats with our hosts and a thriving community of X-Files, and other premium interviews and specials. To find out more and subscribe, you can go to patreon.com/thexcast. That's patreon.com/thexcast.
We are also part of the We Made This podcast network, full of popular culture shows, including our Millennium series, The Time Is Now. You can find all of our shows at our website, wemadethispod.com, or via Twitter at wemadethispod.
Thanks for listening, and keep watching the skies.